Welcome to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice, as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We will relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we chose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.
We're back with you. It's the two of us, Scott and me, and this time I'm going to be following up my first interview with Scott with a second interview with Scott. We just feel like there's a lot to talk about with these clearance committee opportunities that come along in our lives, and it's not just one, and it's not just one decision. A lot of times it's multiple, and it goes on for years, and so we're just going to follow up with him and kind of pick up at one point in the story from last time, which is about college and your double major, which was business and computer information systems, which turns out to be useful for us with Zoom and with podcasting. Yeah, but it's a long road since then to get to that point. However, you did have a job lined up after college and then suddenly left the country for Ghana. So can you talk about your motivation for that?
Absolutely. I think, of course, I grew up in the church and had a strong Christian influence from the very beginning and served in the church. I was the guy that had the drug problem. My parents always drugged me to church. It was drug me Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. It was great. We grew up very committed to our church community, and that continued on through college. I went to a local university, and I continued to serve in our home church. And also, while I was at college, we had a locally run campus crusade group. It was student-led and kind of under a director over an area of a number of universities. And so I was very active in that. And at some point along the way, I really just experienced a greater hunger for a personal knowing of God. It was everything. I knew all the right answers. I had lived the right answers. But I had such a hunger for him personally. And I remember almost in tears at times going to bed at night, praying with such earnest longing for more of God. And so this really became sharpened halfway through my senior year. And I determined I was tired of reading the stories about other people. I wanted to be a part of the story. And I was thinking about this even last night. This was honestly the thought that went through my mind. Well, when we're in these services, we'd have missionaries that would come through from time to time. Our church supported a number of missionaries. And if you wanted to be a good Christian, you became some sort of lay leader. If you wanted to become a great Christian, you became a pastor. And if you wanted to be untouchable, you became a missionary. And it was this unspoken hierarchy of, well, goodness, if somebody's doing mission work, they have an inside scoop of heaven itself, and they're always in touch with the Lord, and he loves them more because they're doing his bidding around the world. And that was almost a kind of an unspoken underlying thought of mine. And I thought, you hear these incredible stories of God moving in these contexts that people come to our church and talk about. And I thought I'd love to be a part of that instead of just listening to that. And so that was really a true motivation, leaving college and spending the summer in Ghana. It was a hunger to see what God was doing somewhere else. And it actually turned out to be so transformative for me personally. It was, I kind of had this mentality going in, what an awesome gift that we have some people coming from the Western world to go in and minister to these people who are clearly in need. When we got there, I found, oh, God's waiting for me here in the lives of these people. And he is using that to dramatically transform my perspective and also me as a person. And so I came home at the end of that summer knowing full well, I am called to a life of missions. I will stay here for the rest of my life. How can I get back overseas? That really was my motivation.
Okay. So you came back, and then what were these future plans, and where did you go?
So ironically enough, the first trip that I went on was supposed to be to Kenya. And we were supposed to spend the summer in Kenya. And there was something that happened that put travel in a bit of uncertainty. Something happened within the country politically or something of the sort at the time. And this was 2003. And we were not allowed to go. They had sent out a warning to anybody traveling to Kenya. And this happened maybe a month and a half before we were to leave. So we get the email one morning. I opened my inbox. The email was waiting on me. We're not going to Kenya, but don't worry, we've rerouted to Ghana. So Ghana was wonderful. We had an incredible experience, but I still had this desire. I want to go to Kenya. It was just stamped inside of me. And so when I got back from Ghana, I knew that I was going back to Africa and I was going to go to Kenya this next time at any cost. So I also knew that I needed some additional training, and this was sort of a clearness committee crossroads, because I had some people in my ear saying, what about the hungry and lost people that are here in this country? You don't have to go on the mission field to reach people like that if that's your motivation. And then I had others who were big champions of going back overseas. And I asked some confidants about what they thought about going to seminary. And it all worked out beautifully. I was able to start seminary. I worked for a year after I got back home, not in the job that was lined up for me, not in the field that I was trained in for all of my university work. And after that year, I went back to Kenya over the next few summers while I was in seminary studying cross-cultural church planting. And it was a beautiful hand-in-glove arrangement that couldn't have been orchestrated any better, and so clear that the Lord was leading through those steps at that time. And I was certain I was going to be a career missionary and was fully prepared to move permanently to Kenya after seminary was over. However, that was not the case.
So in college, I spent a couple of months in Austria, and that's what really put in my heart this burden for Europe. How broad would you say this, burden was that you had? Was it specifically Kenya? Was it more Africa? I mean, how would you characterize it?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a little bit hard to nail down. There was something inside of me that even to this day, I'm not sure, obviously placed by the Lord. It's amazing how he burdens different ones of his own with areas of ministry. And I always had a burden for Africa, and I loved Africa, and I love the people of Africa just as a continent. One thing that really impressed me about Kenya was it was such a great training and sending nation. And I felt like it was a ripe opportunity to go over and assist in training individuals for the ministry that would then take that to other countries. And that was part of what we did while I was there, working with one Bible college specifically, was work with people who had come to Kenya to be trained to then go back to their home, whether it was Congo or Sudan or Ethiopia. We had some people from Eritrea. Uganda was really easy. It was right across the border. We met with a lot of people from Uganda, and Tanzania was quite similar. And so I was really impacted by the opportunity that Kenya afforded. It was a little bit more, Nairobi was a little bit more centralized. And so that was one of the reasons that I really had this burden for Kenya. But there was part of me that almost felt like I was born in Africa and I was returning back home. It's hard to describe unless you actually experience a place where you feel so called and you feel very much at home. In fact, so much so that the cultural differences going there from America were so insignificant, it seemed to me, and returning home was so much more profound and difficult.
Mm. So when you returned after your last trip to Kenya, did you know you were returning permanently?
That I did not. In fact, I had been over there for a year, and the groups that had been over there with us and with our organization ranged anywhere from 10 days, a month, 2 months, to the longest was 9 months, a 9-month kind of a 2-semester presence there. And I was coming home in early September with the full assurance of going back in January. And when I was at home, sort of knew this was a little bit of a period of downtime, almost like I was on furlough, catch back up with people, work on some fundraising for going back. And it was an indefinite amount. It was almost as if it was similar to what you described, signing back up for a year, signing back up for a year. And so that was sort of the mentality. And all of that changed December the 27th, 2007, when the stable Kenya that we had been working in fell into great difficulty because of the election that went awry. I was so certain I was going back. I even begged them, look, I know enough about Kenya. I can go somewhere where there's not so much danger and trouble, but it was widespread there in Nairobi. And wisely, they said no. When that happened, I was devastated. I had so, and wrongly so, wrapped my identity up in mission work that if that was not a part of what I was doing, I didn't know who I was. And so I felt almost like I did years before graduating from college, with this world of possibility and feeling as if I had no direction whatsoever. It was a very difficult time.
So what's your interaction with missions work presently?
So presently, we still have a lot of friends that we worked with that we remain in contact with. It was so lovely. I met my wonderful wife, Teresa, on my 2005 trip over to Kenya. She was part of the team that I was on. And through the most lovely of all Hallmarkish stories, we fell in love. And so we were married in 2011. And in 2015, when she was doing some continued work for residency here in Greenville, South Carolina, she had an opportunity to work abroad, do a rotation abroad. So she got credit for it. And she would be working in the hospital in Kijabe, one of the areas that we visited, training doctors, not just for that area, but also other parts of Africa. And crazy enough, they had a boarding school there, K through 12. They also had a Bible college that was there on the same compound. And it was a match made in heaven. So we spent a month there in 2015 and continued to be in touch with people that we interacted with then. And there's always part of us that is still a little bit there. Our times, our situations here have changed significantly. Now having children and being in sort of a different leadership role here in America, but it still remains close to our heart.
And what would your counsel be for those who are thinking about potentially participating in missions work?
I would absolutely encourage it. I think you and I probably had the same perspective where at one time we saw the negatives of short-term missions, and a lot of people can be very critical of short-term missions because of the instability it may create over a 10-day or 2-week period or month period in the churches that people visit overseas. But I think it was such a profound and transformative experience for me. I only wish going over there I had the mentality of recognizing I'm not taking something to someone. I'm going to experience what God is doing there already in their midst. It's a much bigger picture than just our short-sightedness. I would absolutely encourage anybody to go. I think to see Christianity from another cultural perspective, to see the faith that operates outside of our Western intellectualism that so strips the gospel of its glory and power, was so incredible that I would recommend anybody go. In fact, if there was a possibility, everybody has to have some sort of cultural Christian experience before they graduate, I would push for that. I think it was just so transformative.
Yeah, and I would echo how important it is that happens either during college or maybe right after college, something like that. There seems to be very formative
It absolutely
about those
is.
years. Yeah. And it seems to have a long-term influence.
Absolutely.
So how significant was the jump from the mission field to academia back in the state?
It was significant. There was two things I never saw myself doing, pastoring or being involved in education. It wasn't that I had any aversion to those things. It just seemed to me like those who were engaged in that vocation had something that I didn't have. To me, it looked like those were difficult professions, required a lot of work, and required grace that I just had not available in my life. And so coming back after being so crushed when I couldn't go back on the mission field and finding myself just sort of floating along. You described it as a ship with its anchors all pulled up and just sort of, you're just there and you've got no direction. When the opportunity arose to get involved with teaching middle school and high school, I thought it was absolutely crazy to even consider that. However, I was able to, after the Lord made it really clear through prayer and seeking Him, I was able to recognize that in my life, I'd already had roles like that. Teaching in the church is such a big ministry that there's a spiritual gift just dedicated to teaching the body of Christ. And it was amazing. It's not like God said, I'm going to give you this gift only for the edification of the church, just to be used on Sunday mornings and never to be considered again. It was a high calling that God places within the lives of people. And I realized in my service in the church, in my service in our Christian communities in college and mission work, it was all teaching based, and it wasn't a huge leap, not as big of a leap as I thought it would be. And I noticed that as I got involved with that, it wasn't that my passion toward missions began to wane. It was that my heart knew I was entering a new season, and that sort of adventurous spirit came back, and the excitement of being on the mission field was sort of cultivated in just a different context because it was still service for the Lord. And so it was a different language. It was a different setting. There were a lot of things I had to pick up on quickly that I didn't know were part of what was required of a teacher. But I did know that I felt like God had given me the heart for education and the heart for people. And that had a number of different manifestations, and teaching was just one of them. So that was a big change, in part because I knew that season before was completely closed. There was no way I was able to go back at that time. And then just being uncharted territory, it was a big change. But I think one thing that was just a tremendous testament to God's presence and grace was that I never once felt like I was alone or I didn't have what it took. God was so good to surround me with very wise people that I learned from then and even now, with being able to interact with you and watch you as you've been in this world far longer than I. And He was so good to put people in my path that were clearness committees in and of themselves, but also sort of a divine holy guide that helped that process tremendously.
And how did you decide for the doctorate?
So doctorate, I realized this was something that was the brilliance of my father, who I think in this life I will never quite grasp how wise he was. I had this kind of rogue mentality, this maverick mentality. I don't need to get any further education. God's given me spiritual gifts. I've got everything I need. And I remember saying to him, even when I was starting the process for ordination in the Wesleyan Church, I don't need a committee of men and women to put a rubber stamp on me when God has already rubber stamped me. And I look back and I kind of cringe at that mentality, because we're not some sort of one soldier army serving the Lord. But I remember this, Dad said this to me several times, that further education will open doors that otherwise would not be open to me. And of course, initially I wanted to kick back. God's the way maker. He'll open a door, he'll open a window. But I realized this was an opportunity that God had set before me to help make me the best version of myself that is available for his service. And so I remember my dad said that specifically about my first master's program that I went into, and I was struggling whether I should do it or not. And that was when he told me, this will open doors that would otherwise remain closed to you. And he would echo that onward. And even when I talked several years back when he was still alive about considering a doctorate, he was thrilled because he thought this is another sort of tool that can go in the belt that will open up a better or broader range of influences. And so it was something that I never, ever considered. In fact, I remember distinctly when I worked so hard in college with this double major, and I thought, boy, this is great. I've arrived. I've achieved everything in life, and this is it. I'll never have to go into another classroom. But then there was that hunger that continued to stir. So that was a big aspect of it. The second part was I genuinely love learning, and I genuinely love knowing God intimately. And especially with this doctoral program being rooted in spiritual formation, it's almost just as much for me as any skill set that I would get out of it. And it has thus far been so transformative that it's kind of like when you see a great movie or a great TV show, or you experience something, you want everybody else around you to experience it as well. That's sort of the feel, that it's just this great time of discovery. So I'm sure this will not be the last educational journey for degrees or certificates or who knows what else. But it has been incredibly rewarding.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you the question that you probably can't answer, which is, given your background to date, and let's say that you're done with the doctorate, and the missions and the higher ed and all that, I mean, what kind of a future could you imagine?
Yeah, in fact, last night, Teresa and I were talking about that exact thing. She was asking herself the same question, because there's a unique program that is geared toward doctors that's like a master's level program, but how theology and medicine interact. And she said, oh, I would love to sign up for something like that. And it's kind of new. And one of her colleagues had just completed the program. And I said, it's wild that our worlds sort of overlap in some ways. We saw that quite sharply when we were serving just for that month back in Kenya, and she was doing the doctoring work, and I was there at the Bible college. And we do very much feel like our work is in tandem, that we work together for the whole person, spirit, soul, and body. And so I know that it involves some sort of working together towards those things. I look back, and you made the statement yesterday, people think you've always done education and always been involved in what you do. And you look back and see these seasons that it's almost like puzzle pieces that don't look like they would fit together. But when you look at it all as one image, you see they each have their own perfect place. And so it's kind of an unorthodox trail to walk to get to this point. And I don't know, honestly, where it will lead, but I do have the confidence that when I look back, every season that I've been through, when it gets toward the end, God begins to awaken a new desire inside. And as that area is awakened and brought to life, and I end up falling in love with something new or a new adventure, I see that I couldn't have gotten there were it not for every single thing before that took place exactly in its right time. And I really think that's a great lesson that I would have told my younger self. Trust the process. You don't go from 0 to 60 in a few seconds flat. It's going to take a long time to walk out, because I needed to change. It wasn't that I was waiting for something out there to change. It was that I had to be transformed in those areas to be able to fully walk in authority there. And so who knows where it'll go.
So is it fair to say that you do not consider higher ed and missions work to be mutually exclusive?
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that they do go hand in hand, and it's not necessarily an either or. And I think probably the involvement of things in the past allows for much broader involvement of things in the future. And I'm doing things that I would have never imagined could be actual ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And you made this great statement when you were sharing about your mission experience, that it wasn't, ministry is not just shipping out to missions, not just shipping out to some country, standing up at a podium and preaching for the masses, that it involves so many different aspects. And that is exciting when you look at how it would only a God-sized plan from such a tremendous Lord we serve could bring those kind of things together.
Yeah, and I would add for anyone listening that interest and excitement is good. God's grace is necessary, but we also sometimes need qualifications. Sometimes that's exactly what's missing. And I'm talking about like overseas. That was my experience with Ukraine, not really understanding why I was getting my doctorate until I got to Ukraine, and understanding the value of it and how it was viewed and how it could open doors in terms of beginning degree programs and that sort of thing that was really, really needed over there. So an author that I've read, he talks about his famous phrase is "nothing is wasted." And I encourage everybody listening to my voice not to ever try to deny some part of your experience and say, well, God can't use that, or that was really dumb and I shouldn't have done that, and therefore, let's just move on. It's amazing what God will redeem.
It is so true. Absolutely.
He does redeem, but more importantly, he's the Redeemer. He is the creator of redemption. He's really, really good at it. And so if we will not hide things away or kind of segregate them out, a lot of times God can kind of integrate them into what it is that he actually needs, which is amazing.
So true.
Well, thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
I appreciate that.
This may not be the last time.
It might not be. And I think that just personally, it's been great to hear your experience on the mission field and see that there is this nature of humanity that we share these similar experiences. They may look different on the surface, but we all kind of go through these journeys, and trusting in the process that God is never finished making us into the best version of ourselves. I love the value he places on individuals, so much to the point I heard Reinhard Bonnke say this, the great African evangelist who saw almost 100 million people come to the Lord. And he was speaking and he said, a lot of people ask me if I will pray for them so that they can have an anointing like mine. He said, God created one Reinhard Bonnke. He said, you wouldn't want to carry this mantle, and I couldn't carry the one that you have. And it was such a great reminder that God looks at us individually and gives us gifts and skills and abilities to the point that there's not another Paul Schatzberger that could fill the roles that you have, and there's not another Scott Williams, and there's not another whoever might be listening, that there's this awesome individuality that God has put together in such uniqueness that he gets the glory as we live out that to the fullness. What a blessing. Thank you so much. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next episode. Blessings to you all.